Isaiah J. Thompson is easily one of the most versatile pianists of his generation, with an incredible list of accolades, including winning the 2023 American Pianist Award and Cole Porter Fellowship in Jazz, and collaborating with artists like Wynton Marsalis and John Pizzarelli. He has several dynamic albums as a leader, and he's absolutely a voice you need to know. Now, with his latest release, the Book of Isaiah Modern Jazz Ministry, releasing on Mack Avenue on June 6th, he's melding his command of blues and swing traditions with spiritual music and bringing his faith to the foreground. Today, I am joined by Isaiah to discuss this new record and everything in between. So, Isaiah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely.
So, I wanted to start with asking about preparing for this suite, preparing for this album. And I'm lucky enough to have known you for quite a few years. And one of the things that I admire about you is how much you value study and being a student and gaining knowledge. And you've talked a little bit about how the study of the book of Isaiah, your namesake, actually helped you begin this journey into faith. And eventually you even pursued this study in seminary to learn more about faith. I'm curious, how has study in seminary helped you or maybe changed your approach to music and composition and performance? Because you've been to the Juilliard School, you studied music formally, but studying spirituality and God could really affect the way that you approach something that maybe before felt like second nature.
That's a great question. I think for me, just looking at just biblically what's going on, and you start to really try to understand what happened, especially in the Old Testament, they're not using easy language if you're not used to it. You're not used to it. Especially in the book of Isaiah, you're talking about the relationship between Assyria, Babylon, these different things, invasions that are going on, people leaving the relationship with God, some people fighting for it, right? You have believers and non-believers having a role in what's going on in the history of the people and in faith. And so for me, I think one of the things that was great to see was that some of the issues and things that people deal with today, when you start to actually read it, you see it's been happening for forever. And that's, I think, where I can find some of the issues and things I've had to deal with and learn from. I see how people dealt with it then. One of my greatest realizations was just not characterizing, especially like the word and the Bible, as something of what I thought it is, as opposed to just reading it. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems so simple. Like it was a funny thing. It seems so simple, but when I actually just started to do it, it's like, you know what? Let me actually read this, and it's like this is not what people said it was, and it's not what I thought it was based on what people said to me. And so when I read it for myself, that's when a lot of those questions started to be answered.
Yeah, just building your own personal relationship through interaction, which I think is
Right.
something, even when we think about music and the music that we love in jazz, is so important when it comes to listening. For example, like people will tell you, okay, you need to listen to this album, you need to check out this person based on the relationship that they've built.
Right.
But to really internalize a lot of that language and music and even their story, you do have to engage with it on a personal level and
Right.
and start to internalize what your experience and what you're reading and what it actually is right there in front of you. So that's such a really interesting connection. And something that also happened, I guess, in the lead up to putting this suite together and the record is you dealt with tendonitis, you dealt with this injury. I think
Right.
injuries are something that happen to musicians often and maybe don't get talked about a lot because it's a very serious and it could be a very scary thing. And so this injury, I'm sure, led to this moment of like self exploration and examination of who am I? And can you talk a little bit about how that moment when you're dealing with not necessarily being able to play made you question things or maybe even helped you build your relationship with faith because things were different now?
Yeah. My entire identity was in my playing. And what is a musician without the capability to play? If your entire identity is built into that. And that was something I had to realize the hard way. And for me, I think it was somewhat of an embarrassment thing. I think in the beginning, it's how do you navigate the situations where you're supposed to play something you've committed to playing and perform it somewhere, but you can't
Mm-hmm.
really. But you necessarily don't want to talk about it because then someone's not sure if they can rely on you necessarily in the future. That's the truth. That's the honest situation. And for me, I just had to start being honest about what it was. And to say, you know what, I need to put my identity in something else that's far greater than something earthly, something that I can rely on that has to do with me more so than the masks I'm putting on for myself. Right now, I love playing. Like it's never to villainize loving what you do. Like I love playing, but that can't be the end all. That can't be the end of why I do what I do. So for me, I've just been trying to live more of a confessional life in that way. So I just confess about it. This is something I deal with. I think that I found power in that weakness now, confessing that's something that I've dealt with, weaknesses that I have. And it's also made me think about what is really worthwhile to play. You know, is this going to be actually worth playing and worth listening to? Or is this something that am I flaunting potentially technical facility in a certain way? Is it really necessary? Or is it something that's going to really communicate what I want to communicate to an audience? And I have to start to figure that out because there are possible physical consequences if it's not really necessary. So it helped
Mm.
my playing, I think, at this point.
Wow. I didn't even think about it that way about the honesty of it all and how hard it is to be honest about your limitations when the expectation is from other people that you're at a certain place. So that's the way that you articulated that is very beautiful to me, that you're like, there's actually a lot of freedom in being honest and being almost like selective about what can I use my gift for? What can I use my ability for? Because nothing is like infinite in that way. Like you have to be selective with that. So it's really, I really like the way that you said that, and talking too about making music that is meaningful because I'm using that selective time. And so it's a great way to segue into the actual album itself and the music that's there. As I mentioned before, I really admire your serious studiousness and your serious knowledge, especially of jazz history and its traditions within the Black historical experience in the US. And from this suite, you've drawn inspiration from artists like Mary Lou Williams, Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, who have incorporated faith into their music, into their playing. What were some kind of like lessons or inspirations you took from their work when building your own suite of this kind? Because I'm sure it could maybe feel a bit overwhelming to think about a piece in that way.
Sure. Yeah. They were also different in how they did it. When I think about people I listen to, from Vince Guaraldi as his own sort of mass to Mary Lou, John Coltrane, Wynton Marsalis, obviously, they all were so different in how they did it. I remember listening to how Mary Lou Williams interpreted the Lord's Prayer. I had listened to Duke's. He does a version with Mahalia, and
Mm.
it's very Baptist sounding, which is great, and I love it. And so when I heard Mary Lou's, it's very almost more ethereal, it's very different. I was like, I didn't know you could do that, and that really challenged me to say, okay, how can my understanding of the music and therefore my understanding of the gospel be represented in a diverse way and in a individual way? And
Mm.
so she particularly challenged me in those ways, and that's I really appreciated listening to how she's interpreted all these things and concepts. And yeah,
Yeah. And like one thing too that I think is really interesting about your approach and even her approach is moving away, or not moving away, but I think often labels in our music can maybe limit their reach to things. So people assume that if there's going to be a spiritual or godly element, it might be a more gospel sounding music. What does it mean to you to incorporate sounds that people more traditionally associate with jazz into your spirituality and into this music itself? Like, what was that like for you?
that's a really good question. A really good question because that's something. Yeah, that's a really great question. That's something that I've had the challenge of doing throughout writing and putting out this recording is first not I never wanted to be pinned as, oh, this is a young black man that grew up
Mm,
in church and this is what he does. He plays gospel music. That's just there's nothing wrong with that. That's just not my story.
right.
Someone who I stopped going to church for a long time. That's not that wasn't really my experience like that. And understanding that the sound of the gospel is not necessarily gospel music,
Right.
right? And just because it's gospel music does not mean that it communicates the gospel, right? And dealing with, I believe that the body is diverse. We talk about just how many people in every tribe, every tongue. All these things, there's so many ways to use your gifting to serve in this way. And I see this project as sort of part of an arts ministry in a way. How can I use what I feel like the Lord has given me to serve? And it doesn't mean that the Lord doesn't want you to have fun either. I think I love jazz. I love the music. I've always loved the music. And I was like, okay, things like the blues, I think is such a great way of exemplifying what the sound of the gospel is. It's both happy and sad. That's like what I would call almost the birth of the blues, is that
Mm.
understanding of what does it mean to be in pain, but it's going to be okay. People using that to get through all types of human trials. So I was definitely excited to do this because I was like, the sound of the gospel doesn't have to be a certain type of music. It can just
Mhm.
be through the eyes of whoever's being spoken into.
And I think that interpretation could really encourage people too to explore their relationship to God, spirituality, religion, whatever it may be at the end of the day. Because, like I said before, I think often the assumption is that a spiritual music can sound a certain way, and music about God will sound a particular way. And some people are inherently turned away from that. And so I think this
Mm.
record really welcomes in questions and welcomes difference in a way that I think is really special and exciting. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, of course, you're joined by a fantastic band: Marty Jaffe, Miguel Russell, Cyrus Chestnut, Herlin Riley, Julian Lee, amazing people. But you also include vocals on this record. Vuyo
Mm.
Satache is featured, and you also have your wife, Caitlin, who is featured in backing vocals. And I was curious about the significance of having voices on this record for you. I think people associate hearing the gospel quite literally through a voice if someone is reading it to you, if someone is telling it to you. So, does that kind of inform your choice to have Vuyo and other voices singing? Why was that something that was really important for you to have here?
Sure. Yeah, I feel like I just fell into that.
Mm,
Honestly, I think as I was writing some of these pieces, I really wanted to make sure what I was communicating was going to be received. And some things, they don't need the words, but some things do. You need to hear, I pray for strength and love to fight the battle that shall set us free. That's the theme that you hear. In the beginning, the highest calling, you hear it in the feeling of freedom. You hear the bridge kind of show up in different places. So when you hear these themes played musically throughout the suite, in other places you can hear where it was sung.
mm,
And so some of those themes I want you to be able to recognize while also being informed in, okay, these are the words to this theme. So when I hear them here, I know what it means. And I
right.
understand what it represents in the context of this new song. That's about something that's related, but something a little bit different, right? When you hear the bridge of Spring Flower, you hear it in other places and it means something a little different. But I think, especially when we're communicating about the relationship between faith and race and between prayer and all these things, I think it's important to be really clear as possible. I want to be super clear when I'm thinking about when Frederick Douglass talks about the difference between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ. I think that's super important we need to talk about this, and I want to make sure I communicate it as clearly as possible. And I thought words would help.
Yeah. And I think too, for me as a listener, hearing that, like you said, sometimes you don't need the words. It's crystal clear. You can feel that theme going through the entire suite, through the music. But I think Vuyo has such a powerful instrument, a
Absolutely.
powerful voice for something like this. And so being able to hear that throughout the suite in different places, especially with the Lord's Prayer, I think is just it's very powerful to have that. And I think the way that it is arranged is really interesting. I grew up Catholic, so there's I won't say it's limited,
Right.
but there's very particular ways that that prayer is said and that prayer is interpreted. And so I think the way that you have it on the record, and hopefully people will hear it and listen to it and really feel welcomed by it, but also I think challenged musically, because it isn't what you might assume it could be. If you're in a church service, I think often the goal is to have as many people sing, have as many people participate as
Right.
possible. And I
Right.
think not everyone is going to be able to sing it. And that's okay
Right.
too, because I wonder, do you feel like that invites people to really listen and internalize more?
Okay, that's another great question. Yeah, when you're dealing with like my wife Caitlin, she's has so much experience leading worship. And when you're leading worship, generally It's less about the music as opposed to leading people in prayer and worship. A lot of times that happens because people are able to engage with it, like physically are able to maybe sing along or things, as they put the slides up so you can see the words and things like that. And so this is a bit of a different thing where, like you're saying, like who can sing like Julio, you know? And but I do think in these different arts ministries, we've seen where people say, "This is, I feel like the Lord has gifted me in this way. It's something I want to share with you so that you can enjoy this." And I think it's a little different. But I think about people, they go to see worship concerts, and of course they sing along, but also in those ways, they're more, maybe they're a little bit more for performance. It's not inherently bad. I think if you go maybe a little too far into this is only about the performance, and we're not going to talk about, if that's your goal at least, we're not going to talk about the reason for why we're singing these things or playing these things, which is why I try my best to explain these things, especially when, if you come to see one of the performances, I try to explain them. But yeah, I think it is a bit different. And so that is something I've had to navigate. And I think every person has to navigate if they're in any sort of arts ministry is how do I communicate this if it's not inherently communal in the way that we're
Mm,
used to in a church setting?
yeah. And that is a challenge, right? That's a really big challenge because I think, again, I was raised Catholic, so there's a lot of call and response. There's a lot of exactly what's going to be said when, how to engage in that way. And I think it's such a beautiful thing for anybody, whether you are a Christian or not, to think about how do I engage and listen differently when it comes to hearing how other people engage with their faith, but also how can I just engage with, even if you, like I said, if you're coming from a different religion, like engage with this story and in this understanding that is written down and now being shared with me through music. And I'm glad that you talked about arts ministry because I wanted to ask you, like, what does it, how do you deal with that challenge? Because I think sometimes we feel like when creating art, it could be for yourself, but now when it's crossing into ministry, it's a devotion to not only God, but also bringing in other people. And do you think when you do this performance, it's just as equally important to give your all in the music as it is to give a window into why you're doing it and what inspired you?
Yes, I think for this record in particular, it's about like my personal testimony. Like we talk about the book of Isaiah and talking about how I had this name, right? I'm walking around with without having read it or understanding anything about it.
Yeah.
I'm having, I think it was a bit of a lifeline to have it. I had to speak it every day of my life until I had to actually figure out what it was. But I think for me, it's a part of, it's about me expressing to the audience and to whoever's interested in listening that my testimony wasn't the normal route, but also to for people to realize that there is no normal route and that there is such a diverse understanding and a diverse body of people that have all come to this in different ways. And just recording is a bit of a different way of explaining how I came to it, and you can hear it. This is not maybe what you're used to, but I'm also not going to be so prideful to say that it was my idea. You start to look into history, like we talked about Mary Lou Williams, it's a Donald Byrd. You start to see Duke, his sacred concerts. You start to see, okay, this has been done, you know, and just to let people know that they are always welcome
Mm,
and there's not one way that it looks.
right. And I think that is really important. And through the sound of the record itself is clear because it is a suite, it is connected. There are these themes going through, but there's also different kind of, I don't know, maybe the word is like the music, each song has a very clear like difference from each other. It's not, oh, if I listen to it all the way through I can't tell where it's
Right.
changing, like you can hear that. And the highest calling for me, I think, is one of those songs that can really welcome in people who are experiencing this faith from different, even different global places, right? Into something
Sure.
that might sound more familiar to the way that they are engaging. Was
Sure.
that intentional for you in that piece in particular to welcome in like what is such a different sound there?
Right. For that, I think for the highest calling, a lot of it was inspired by John Coltrane, that
Mm,
sound, resolution, things like that. So a lot of the pieces are modeled or inspired by specific works of these people that have created what we call sacred jazz or jazz, inspired by the divine or divinity. And so that one in particular, it just deals with a lot of things. You get to hear the theme for the first time that I was explaining that you hear show up throughout the rest of the suite. But you're also, like you said, you're getting some cultural things. You're getting maybe more African understanding what's going on within the rhythm section. I also wanted it to sound very inclusive because there's not like hard chord changes necessarily, and so it reminds us of like the brilliance that John Coltrane could, or McCoy Tyner, and that people of that way of composing could bring to music without the harmonic sensibility being too complicated where you feel like it's hard for you to engage with it. You know, that if you actually look at it, the chord changes are not that difficult if you
Hmm.
understand music, but actually creating upon that, I think is what's the challenge about it. That's the genius that comes from people like I mentioned. And so it's talking about how do you deal with what you want to do and then
Mm,
what God wants you to do and how do you negotiate that?
yeah. So I have one kind of last question for you, and it's a big
Yeah.
question, but I think it's an important one because, like I said earlier, everyone has a different relationship with religion, with faith. What is something, whether or not people come from a spiritual background, you hope that they can hear and take away from this record right now in this moment when it's in their headphones? What's something that you hope they can really maybe not instantly understand, but work through?
Yeah. I think particularly in this time, which it can be very divisive, I think I just want people to see that it's not always what they say it is. They being the conclusions you come to on your own, things you think maybe you're fed through media or news or things. A lot of times, it's not what they say it is. I also talk about this a lot when it comes to race. Like my wife is Filipino, and we talk about just dealing with what we have to deal with as an interracial couple. Just coming to terms with what we are is not what they say we are, and
Mhm.
you actually having to live it and see it through the lens of somebody who's actually living these things, whether it's through faith or something else. It's not what they're saying it is, and so it's worth investigating for yourself, and it's worth seeing what are all the facets of this thing and how diverse can it look, and is there room for me? I think
Mhm.
that's something that I was trying to communicate through this recording.
Is there room for me? I really like that. And I hope people who get to listen to the record, which is fantastic and I really enjoyed, will find that because I did. I think that's something that really did come through for me is reinvestigating my relationship with what's going on here, with my interpretations of what spiritual music can sound like. And I think that is something that people are really going to take away. So, congratulations. I cannot wait for everybody to hear this record. And it's fantastic.
Thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate it.